All right, so are you ready for a deep dive today? We're going on a little trip back in time to the Netherlands,
A trip through time sounds exciting. Where are we headed?
where we're going to explore how Dutch society transformed between 1978 and 2008. 3 decades of change. It's amazing we have these school lesson plans and historical overviews.
Oh, wow, that's a great way to understand how the Dutch saw themselves during this period.
Exactly. It's like looking through different lenses. And get this, one of the big questions is, you know how the Netherlands was considered a guide country after World War II?
Right, they were kind of a model for social progress.
So with the Cold War ending and Europe changing like crazy, did they hold on to that status?
That's a big question. And from these sources, it looks like there was a lot going on. You have the Polder model, the rise of individualism,
Oh, and don't forget about all those different youth cultures popping up.
and how could we forget the internet? It practically exploded onto the scene during this time.
Completely changed the game. But okay, let's rewind a bit.
Yeah, let's set the scene. Imagine the Netherlands in the late 70s, early 80s. The Cold War is still a thing, and they're starting to feel the weight of their welfare state, like a lot of Western nations.
Right, like they built this amazing safety net, but then
But then reality set in, it was expensive, and there was a lot of bureaucracy, maybe too much, And that's where you see this shift.
is this where neoliberalism starts to make its mark?
Exactly. Under Lubbers, they introduced austerity measures and started privatizing some industries. And of course, this is when the Polder model takes center stage.
Okay, I got to ask. I've heard this term, Polder model. What's the deal with it?
Well, think of it this way. Everyone's willing to sit down, talk things out, find a compromise. It's all about building consensus, finding solutions that work for everyone.
Very Dutch, right. Always striving for that middle ground.
Absolutely. It reflects their history of cooperation and pragmatism. Even the name polder model comes from those polders, the reclaimed land. It's like they're working together to build something new from nothing.
So they took that same Polder spirit and applied it to politics and economics.
Exactly. And in the short term, it seemed to work. The economy starts picking up in the late 80s. They benefit from globalization, European integration.
I mean, they signed the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, right? That's a pretty big deal.
Huge. They held the presidency when the groundwork was laid for the European Union and the euro.
Wow, they were leading the charge. But I'm curious, did everyone benefit?
That's the key question, isn't it? From what we see in these sources, it seems like social gaps started to widen.
Really, even with the Polder model?
Yeah, even with all that emphasis on consensus, there were still winners and losers, in this new economic landscape. Not everyone rode that wave of prosperity.
Interesting. So we have economic recovery, but also growing inequality.
Right. And that brings us to another big theme, the rise of individualism. You see it everywhere. A smaller role for the government, advertising and consumerism on the rise, and the decline of pillarization.
Pillarization. No, I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, so picture this. Dutch society divided into these separate pillars based on religion and ideology. Catholic, Protestant, socialist, liberal, each with their own schools, newspapers, unions, you name it.
Like parallel universes.
Exactly. But starting in the 60s and 70s, those pillars begin to crumble. People start defining themselves less by group affiliation and more by their individual choices, their own aspirations.
Because I'm breaking free from tradition. Sounds pretty individualistic.
And this shift had some pretty big consequences. Like, the Netherlands becomes the first country to legalize same-sex marriage in 2001, and they enact euthanasia legislation in 2002.
Yeah, those are pretty groundbreaking social policies, definitely pushing boundaries. But how does this rise of individualism connect with the average person?
Great question. Imagine a society where the government is less involved in your personal choices. You've got more freedom to express yourself, pursue your goals, define your own identity.
Sounds liberating.
It can be, but there's a flip side. As those traditional support systems fade away, are we all equipped to handle this new world on our own? That's something the Netherlands was wrestling with, and honestly, it's something we all still grapple with today.
It's a good point. And speaking of grappling, things get really interesting when we look at what was happening with youth culture during this time. The sources point to some pretty distinct subcultures popping up.
Oh yeah, the youth, always a fascinating reflection of what's happening in society. And trust me, things get pretty wild in the 80s and 90s. We'll dive into all that right after the break. So we're talking economic shifts, growing individualism, and how does that all play into the youth culture of the time? It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, what were the kids up to? Were they just going with the flow, or were they pushing back against these changes?
Well, picture this, right? The economic crisis of the 1980s hits, young people facing unemployment, an uncertain future. For some, it's all about punk rock, expressing their disillusionment through music, fashion.
The classic mohawks and ripped jeans. A whole lot of angst.
Right.
It's like the go-to response when you feel like the system is failing you.
Yeah, exactly. But then at the same time, you've got this other fascinating response, the squatting movement.
Oh, right. Young people occupying abandoned buildings.
Exactly. Often politically active, protesting the lack of affordable housing, making a statement about social injustice.
So two very different reactions to the same problem. One is rebellion, the other is activism. It's like two sides of the same coin.
And while all this is happening in the Netherlands, across the Atlantic, rap music is exploding in the U.S.
Born out of the struggles of black communities against racism, right?
Yeah, exactly. Full of social commentary, powerful lyrics. And that music starts resonating with Dutch youth in the 1990s, particularly those from immigrant backgrounds. It's like these global influences blending with local experiences, creating something totally new.
But it wasn't all about social or political statements, was it? There was also gabber.
Oh, yeah, Gabber, that high-energy hardcore techno scene.
Shaved heads, tracksuits.
Music's so fast it can make your head spin. And what's fascinating is it was mostly apolitical. Pure escapism. Just dancing your worries away, finding a sense of community on the dance floor.
So you have some youth engaged in protest and political expression, others just looking for an outlet to have fun, let loose. It shows how diverse youth culture was becoming.
It speaks to that larger trend of individualism. Young people creating their own identities, finding their own tribes, expressing themselves in ways that felt real, authentic to them.
It's like that fragmentation of society playing out in the music, the fashion, even the attitudes of the younger generation.
Hmm.
And speaking of fragmentation, we can't forget the internet revolution. Did it really live up to the hype? Was it as big as the Industrial Revolution?
I think it's definitely up there. Remember that timeline we talked about? J.C. Licklider's vision of a global network back in '62. The U.S. military gets involved, the first computer connection in '69, and then bam, 1991. The World Wide Web, it's accessible to everyone. Suddenly we can store content online. It changed everything.
From dial-up modems to instant messaging. The internet reshaped how we communicate, learn, connect with the world. And the Netherlands? They were right there on the front lines.
Absolutely. Early adopters, embracing its possibilities, communication, innovation, economic growth. But it also raises those questions, right? Did everyone benefit equally? And what about the downsides? Misinformation, privacy concerns, the lines between our online and offline lives blurring. These are all things we're still dealing with.
It's like that saying about Pandora's box. You unleash all this incredible potential, but then you've got these unforeseen challenges.
And those challenges were definitely becoming more apparent by the late 90s, early 2000s. This was also a time of increased migration to the Netherlands. The Schengen Agreement in 1985 had a big impact, allowing for free movement of people within Europe.
More people, more cultural exchange, more diversity. So how did the Netherlands respond to that? Were they welcoming?
At first, there was a generally positive attitude towards multiculturalism. Remember, the Netherlands has this history of tolerance and openness. But then, as we enter the 2000s, we see a shift.
Why the shift? Was it just about the increase in migration, or was there something else going on?
Well, remember those economic disparities. Not everyone was sharing in the wealth. And there was this feeling, a sense of disconnect between citizens and politicians. Like the elite were out of touch with everyday people.
So economic anxiety, political disillusionment, and then boom, 9/11 happens.
Yeah, it was a turning point, not just for the Netherlands, for the whole world. This heightened sense of fear and insecurity, people looking for someone to blame.
And unfortunately, sometimes that blame gets directed at immigrants, at Muslims.
It's true. And this is where Pim Fortuyn comes into the picture. This charismatic but controversial politician, he really tapped into those anxieties, those frustrations, saying multiculturalism had failed, Dutch values were being eroded.
His message resonated with some, but it also divided the nation.
Absolutely. And then his assassination in 2002, just weeks before the election, it shook the country to its core.
A tragic event highlighted the growing polarization.
Even though Fortuyn's views were divisive, his death underlined the need for a more nuanced, compassionate conversation about identity, about belonging, the challenges of integration in a rapidly changing world.
It's a lot to take in. We've gone from the polder model to a world where individualism and globalization are reshaping Dutch society. And we've seen how events on the other side of the world, from the rise of hip-hop to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, can have this huge impact on a small nation like the Netherlands.
It reminds us that we're all interconnected. and that the choices we make today have consequences that reach far beyond our own time.
We've covered so much, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating period in Dutch history. What stood out to you, listeners? What surprised you? What questions are you still pondering? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to leave a comment, like this episode, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
Thanks for joining us on this historical adventure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, right? Something happening over there on Wall Street could send shockwaves all the way to the Netherlands.
It did, though. Were they hit that hard by the banking crisis? I mean, the Netherlands is a pretty stable country, right?
Well, you have to remember they have a small, open economy, reliant on trade, you know?
Mm.
So when the global financial system starts to, well, to crumble, they definitely felt the impact. Banks were struggling, businesses too, unemployment went up. It was a tough time.
Like a domino effect, huh? One thing leads to another, everyone's feeling the pinch.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the economics, you know? Remember all that anxiety we talked about, the divisions, the banking crisis just made things worse. People lost trust in institutions, both political and financial. They wanted someone to blame. And that just fueled more polarization.
So it's like all these threads we've been following, the economic shifts, the rise of individualism, those anxieties about migration, and now this banking crisis, they're all tangled up together, creating this really complex web of challenges.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, we started this deep dive back in 1978. The Netherlands was still seen as a guide country, a model of stability, of consensus.
Right, the polar model.
Exactly. But over these 3 decades, they went through so much change. Economic ups and downs, social and cultural shifts, a digital revolution. They had to figure out their place in a rapidly changing world.
And looking back, it's clear that not everything was perfect. They had their fair share of challenges, and those challenges didn't just disappear overnight. It makes you think, how is the Netherlands navigating these issues today? What do they learn from this turbulent period?
That's the big question, isn't it? And while we don't have all the answers, I think what's important is to realize that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about understanding those forces that shape societies, the choices people make, the consequences, both the intended and the unintended ones that kind of ripple through time.
We've come a long way, haven't we? From the Polder model and its promise of consensus to a world where individualism and globalization have totally reshaped Dutch society.
Yeah.
And we've seen how events half a world away, like the rise of hip-hop or the collapse of Lehman Brothers, can have a profound impact on a nation like the Netherlands.
It's a powerful reminder we're all interconnected, and the choices we make today have consequences that stretch far beyond our own time and place.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this fascinating period in Dutch history. We want to hear from you, listeners. What stood out to you during this deep dive? What surprised you? What questions are you still thinking about? Be sure to leave a comment, like this episode, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.